Sometimes buying an amp can be a little bit daunting, especially if you don't know what you're looking at or where to begin. So I made this video as a guide to help the beginner find the right amp for you. And even if you're not a beginner, well, hopefully this video might help you out. I've been selling guitars and amps for almost a decade now. New, used, and even some vintage, to all sorts of different kinds of players. So I have a little bit of advice or some recommendations for you when looking for your next amplifier and where to begin. This video is mostly geared towards beginners who don't know much in the way of amplification. I also kind of have this video broken up into smaller chapters, time-stamped into the video, so feel free to skip around if you already know what the heck I'm talking about. All right, let's get started. By the way, if you do enjoy this content, do me a favor, thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, as I'd like to help other people, teach them certain things about amps and guitars. Okay, the first thing, solid state or a tube amplifier. These are really the two main houses of amplification. Solid states often have presets that allow for quick tonal scene changes, quickly on the fly changing from a distortion to a clean. A lot of times solid states also have built-in presets for onboard effects like reverbs and delays, or even sometimes modulations like phaser, flanger, tremolo, things within that nature. Solid state amps use a transistor for their power and are often a lot easier to maintain because you're not typically changing parts out on a solid state like you would have to sometimes on a tube amp, as tubes can get old or go bad and will need changing. You're not typically gonna see that on a solid state amp, and if a solid state amp does happen to go bad, the good thing about them is they are typically pretty affordable and easier to replace than a tube amp would be, because tube amps are a lot more expensive. Another thing to consider about solid state amps is they're typically a lot lighter weight. If you're a beginner just getting into the game of amps or looking for your first amplifier, I highly recommend going with a solid state amp. And the reason for this is because it is, one, cheaper, it is, two, easier to carry around, and three, they're often a great way to practice at reasonable volumes in the bedroom without making the neighbors rock out too, or listen to you having to practice Twinkle Twinkle Little Star all night. I wouldn't want to hear that either. That being said, tube amplifiers are often preferred by a more practiced guitar player, as they have a warmth and an analog push to them. I recommend tube amplifiers if you are trying to play with a drummer and you need that volume push, because tube amps can do that. They have a more organic breakup, giving a pleasing distortion to them. Although a lot of tube amps have a really great clean sound. I'm looking at you, Magnatone, even though you're very expensive. One of my favorite tube amps for beginner would be the Fender Blues Jr., because it's not too expensive. You're not spending over $1,000, but you get a loud, great sounding amp that can take pedals really well. It's small and easy to move. It doesn't weigh too much. I think they're like 18 watts, maybe 20 watts, and they can keep up in most gigging situations and are also a great bedroom amp. That being said, tube amps are also a little bit more expensive, starting at about $500 and up. You might be able to find some that are cheaper, but tube amps can go all the way into several $1,000s. Some very collectible amps like $10,000 or more, but you can get a great tube amp right around $500 to $1,000. Another amp to consider would be a modeling amp, which is the newest kind of amp that has brought about controversy because some people consider them to be the end-all be-all amp. It's a digital amp that models old tube amps. If you can have an amp that does all that, you basically can eliminate the need for a tube amplifier. I'm not going to get into the debate in this video about tube amps or modeling amps, but I do want to say, if you want to hear my thoughts on tube amps, be sure and check out the card up top for my tube amp talk, because I love tube amps. Modeling amps are programmed to sound a certain way, and because of that, they are arguably the most versatile of all of the amps. Some great recommendations that I would have for you for these would be like the Line 6 stuff, the Line 6 Helix. There's also the Kemper and the Axe Effect stuff, though those get a little bit more expensive. It's kind of a one and done buy. Once you get them, you kind of just get everything, although there are downloadable packs out there that you can use. The next thing to consider would be looking into a head or a combo. The main difference between a head and a combo is a combo has the amp and a speaker built into one fixture. One unit does all. That's everything. Whereas a head is just the amplifier and does not have a speaker built in. There's an advantage to having just a head, as a speaker carries a lot of different tones. Lots of different speakers sound different with different amps because a speaker is half the tone right there. So moving a head to different speaker setups can give you lots of different versatility. The problem with doing this is if you have gigs or need to move around your equipment, now you need to move around two different units, a speaker cabinet and an amplifier. This gets even harder if you have a 212 cabinet or even a 412 cabinet. Now, most of the time nowadays in a local bar or gigging scene, you typically don't see too many bands playing with a 412, but in bigger gigs, you might see a band using a 412 cabinet to push that sound even farther. I am gonna recommend getting a head, but that's just because I'm a gear junkie and I like to switch my head onto different cabinets for different sounds. I actually have a 112, a 212, and a couple 412s. So maybe I have a little bit of an addiction, I don't know. Yes, so speakers are a huge part of the tone and contribute to the tone heavily. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. But if you don't want to deal with the hassle of having to move that all around, or you're just going to be leaving your tube amp in one spot, a combo might be the way to go for you. The next thing I want to talk about is power, because amps come in all sorts of different power levels. We have low wattage amps, which are going to be quieter amps, and then we have high wattage amps, which is just raw, unhinged power to the next level. Some of these amps can get up into the 100 watts or more, which are extremely loud and are typically only used in a controlled audio setting like a studio or a very large concert or a gig that you might be playing. And even nowadays, a lot of the times, I think a lot of the touring bands are still using less than 100 watts. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. When playing with a drummer, I do recommend a tube amp, typically 18 watts or more, because that will allow your amp to really be heard without having to put a microphone in front of it. 100 watt amps are really cool, but they're very loud and very expensive. If you have the money to drop on a big amp like that and the means to be able to turn an amp up like that, I say go for it. But otherwise, for a more practical amp and a bedroom amp, I would maybe consider something a little bit less. Currently, what I'm using in my setup is a 50 watt amp on a 112 cabinet or a 212 cabinet, and it really allows my sound to push and has a great warmth behind it. I just want to say though, I have moved 412 cabs to and from gigs back in the day, and it was heavy duty. It was a lot. For a beginner, I definitely recommend a Solidstate. My #1 recommended amp right now on the market is the Boss Katana in 2024. So if you're looking for a really affordable amp that has a bunch of onboard effects and can get some decent volume, that is a super solid choice for you. You can even come straight out of it and plug it straight into an interface, which is easy to record. Hope this video helped you out when looking for an amplifier, or if you had any thoughts or maybe didn't know where to turn when looking at amplifiers, tube amp, or solid state. If you don't know where to start with guitars, I suggest you check out my video here on the subject, and hopefully I can help you out there. I'll see you over there in that video, and if you like this one, be sure to like and subscribe to my channel. Peace out.